Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fospender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. Today, it's my thrill to welcome Sands Hall. She is the author of the memoir, Reclaiming My Decade Lost in Scientology, a finalist for the Northern California Book Awards, and Publishers Weekly Best Book in Religion and Spirituality. She's also the author of Catching Heaven, a Willa Award winner, and a Random House Reader's Circle selection. One of my favorite of her books, though, is that she has penned Tools of the Writer's Craft. It is one of my all-time favorite writing craft books, and if you struggle with the idea of point of view, I'm telling you, nobody explains it better than Sands does in this book. Sands is a professor emeritus at Franklin and Marshall College. She teaches for the Iowa Summer Writing Festival and for the community of writers at Squaw Valley. She's a theater artist and a singer-songwriter and performs widely, and she lives in Nevada City, California. Sands Hall, welcome so much to the Morning Glory Project.
I am delighted to be here, Betsy. Thank you.
Well, Sands, I'm going to take a liberty and just read the very first sentence of the preface to your book. Mm-hmm. And the very first sentence reads, "For a decade, I pretended that a decade of my life hadn't happened." Mm-hmm. And I had the fortune of meeting you, I think, during the decade when you weren't talking about that.
That is correct.
So I didn't know any of this history that you have with the Church of Scientology and didn't learn about it until I learned that you were preparing a memoir. So for those listening, I have first a professional acquaintance with Sands, whose mentorship and writing classes I benefited greatly from, and then we've became colleagues and friends as well. So all of that time until the last 4 or 5 years, I didn't know anything about your history. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about what got you to write your book about your lost decade.
That's a wonderful place to start. Thank you so much. It's funny to actually talk that way because, of course, 10 years is a long time to say that it's lost. But 7 of those years, I was involved with the Church of Scientology, and 3 of those years, I was trying to make sure I wouldn't be pulled back in again, because I had been pulled back a number of times. So that's why the decade of it. And I just was so mortified that I had been so gulled into being part of something that I came to see was really destructive to me and to many, many others in many, many ways. And there's lots of news reports out about that. So I don't have to go into too much detail, I imagine. But what happened was, this is a very interesting thing. I didn't realize how important to my getting involved with Scientology, how important it was that my brother had suffered a terrible, terrible brain injury. And a movie was being made about my brother, a documentary about his brain injury and the way he kind of managed to resurface here in Nevada City with a play of his being produced by a local theater company called Loss of Nameless Things, which is a line from my brother Oakley Hall's play. And I was interviewed for that documentary. And it was in the middle of that interview that I realized this extraordinary vertigo, this chaos that had entered my life when my mentor, my friend, my leader, he was 18 months older than I, had suffered this terrible brain injury, and I didn't know who he was anymore, and I didn't therefore really know who I was anymore. And when I looked back from the distance of a couple of decades, I could see now that that spun me towards the church. At that time, I thought, wow, that's interesting. But little by little, I began to write about it, Betsy. And that's when I began to realize I am just sorting this out for myself, or am I actually writing a memoir. And that was an interesting thing to tangle with.
Hmm. So you didn't really start out with the intention of writing for publication. You were writing to sort of sort things out.
Yeah, I was too mortified to think I was writing a memoir.
Well, let's linger there, because a lot of the folks that I interview in this podcast talk about traumas that come to them from external sources. Some, they're the victims of violence or disease or those kinds of things. But in your case, you were a victim of your own choice in a way, and then the choice became not so much a choice.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I go to great pains actually in the memoir to let the reader know that these were my choices, even though I think Scientology has its ways of enforcing its worldview. I believe those of us involved screw those mechanisms into place ourselves. It's like a little headset that we put on that, alters the way we view and the way we think, even when our actual thinking processes are saying to us, that's really weird. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's very interesting. So yes, you're absolutely right. This wasn't, other than that, my brother's accident, which in some ways I think spun me into the church. It was absolutely my own decisions every step of the way.
Well, that's your shame about it.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who knows you and who met you during the time that I did would never have imagined that this had been part of your life before. You're such a strong and forthright and thoughtful and intelligent person. It's hard to imagine such people getting sucked into what, for lack of a better term, is a cult. But reading your book, I found that lots of the people that are involved in Scientology are people that you wouldn't think would be involved in such a thing.
That is absolutely correct. I'm very excited. I'm putting a bit of a band together right now for a concert up here in December. And I was talking to the bass player, and he is friends with Scientologists. He lives in Sacramento and was friends with Scientologists there. And he says, and I talked about the fact that one of the things that pulled me in the first place was a very, very fine bass player named Jamie Font, and that he was such an extraordinary musician, and the people that he hung out with seemed so cool. And those included people like Chick Corea. You kind of felt, well, if they think this thing is cool, this thing might be cool, which is the value of celebrity. Why we have people who are famous wearing mink coats and fancy watches. It's because if they're wearing them, they must be good to wear, or even that's the reason they're famous. I mean, we can even go that far. So that issue of celebrity was really huge and pulled me in. And I think the idea that those friends, if you were to be sitting at a dining table with them, other than the fact they might use the strange acronyms associated with the lingo of Scientology, you would find them delightful, intelligent, kind, compassionate, interested, curious. And those very much were the things that kept me engaged for as long as I stayed engaged.
So tell me if I get this right, but it seems sort of like a three-pronged grip on you in a way. And one was that you're a seeker. You're always seeking understanding. So you were seeking and open to ideas and curious about the spiritual world and curious about your own relationship with it. So there's prong one. Prong two was, as you just said, there were, these talented, smart, compassionate, kind, lovely people that you were also attracted to, and some of them even celebrity. And then the third one, though, is what you talked about a moment ago, which was your brother's accident. And it sort of put you in a vulnerable place. I often think of, that proverbial thing we've seen tragically in so many stories of the young girl from Iowa getting off the bus in LA. She's the runaway, and the pimps know exactly how to find her because she looks lost a little bit. And I wonder if that vulnerability in you of having that you weren't even fully conscious of how much impact it had on you, but that your brother's accident and how it shook up your family in that way made you sort of easy pickings in a way. Easier pickings.
Those three prongs are really well described. I think, ironically, one of the things that I really appreciate about that that decade in the Scientology is I came to great peace, and certainly writing about it, I came to peace with the fact that I am a pilgrim, I am a seeker, I won't stop all my life looking for those things. And that was actually, it's great to be at peace and even excited about that fact. So that's true. And absolutely the very dear friends I made. And yes, this third thing, it's when probably some of your listeners have walked down a street and been accosted by somebody with a clipboard asking, "Are you really happy?" It's a famous Scientology question. Are you really happy? It's a very clever question because what's happy and what's really?
And who's happy every minute and who couldn't
Right.
say, gee, I have some unhappiness, right?
So you take this personality test and they invite you in to see your results. And it's a very, very clever and probably a sales technique that isn't unique to Scientology, but they find in their technology, they call it the ruin. They find the person's ruin. It could be my finances are screwed up, or my marriage is in trouble, or I'm sleeping in my car, or actually they wouldn't be interested in you if you were sleeping in your car. I keep having fights with my parents, or whatever the ruin is, they say Scientology can fix this. And they're not, as far as they're concerned, lying. They believe that Scientology can fix anything.
So the sincerity is also a seducer as well, right?
This sincerity and the absolute sense of certainty. That is tremendously attractive. The sense that this isn't some possibility. You will absolutely fix your life if you take this course and start on this path. This will make your life better.
So anybody that feels as though they've got some brokenness is vulnerable to wanting to be fixed.
It's that little Iowa girl getting off the bus. Absolutely.
So tell me, Sands, your years in Scientology, tell me, I guess I want sort of good news, bad news. What did it cost you? But what did it give you? What I was really struck in reading your book is that yours is not just a fillet of an expose about the horrors of Scientology. It's not that at all. There are certainly those things out there, and you're not saying that it's a great organization by any means. I'm not saying that, people, please. But you're saying that you did gain some things. But what did it cost you?
Mm-hmm.
What are you reclaiming?
To some degree, those years that I don't feel that they are wasted, as I felt, I think, for quite a long time, that whatever I'd done in them was just terrible. No children, no mate, no career, no nothing. I just felt like I had just spent those years studying Scientology. I think the thing that can make me even now get a little weepy is the years when I could have known my parents. That was a huge loss because they say, Scientology will say that they don't have a policy of disconnection, but they do. If someone is against your being in the church, you are supposed to not have anything to do with them. I protested this violently and said, my parents are not, as they were called, suppressive people, for crying out loud. But what did happen as a result of mom and dad's anger and fury, and I see now, I can't even imagine their sorrow seeing that their eldest daughter was doing this with her, the years and years of her life, their tremendous grief and sorrow and anguish about that it was no fun to be around them. So little by little, I stopped seeing them. And I really deeply regret that there's just this huge chunk of years that I didn't get advice and perspective and delight and fun and memories and things that so that's a big loss. I think that's just the other day I received the messages as I've received from people who've read this book have been so moving to me, Betsy. A lot of them have been non-Scientologists at all, just saying, you have given me another way to look at what I've always thought of as my lost years. But the other day I received, just recently too, I think the paperback, because it's less expensive, has generated new sales, which I'm thrilled about. But this ex-Scientologist wrote me to say that his daughter was still in, and that they had been at a, and I said, "Oh, I hope she gets out." And and he said, "We were just at a memorial for a family member, and she refused to not only talk to me, but even look her suppressive father in the eye. She would have nothing to do with me." So that kind of loss, I mean, that just hit me so hard, because I know what she is doing if she ever does manage to get out of the church, that she will have those years that she did not, meet eyes or talk to her father at, let's say, a memorial service. So that is a really scary and sad thing. So those losses are huge. In addition, and I'm glad, Betsy, you bring up that it is not a screed against the Church of Scientology. There are many, many, many such books by former Scientologists who had really terrible experiences. They were deeply inside the machinations and the management of the church, and getting out required escape plans and leaping barbed wire on a motorcycle. And none of that was my experience. But it did take, I did have to sit and listen and list what it was that I did gain there, in addition to what I felt I'd lost.
So you didn't have to escape barbed wire. Your story seems as though you were, I don't want to say on the periphery, but you were not in the heart center of the organization in lots of ways. You lived more independently. You traveled. You did things that were outside of the group. You were acting. You were doing other things. So you didn't have the physical barriers that you had to overcome to get out that some people do, nor did you suffer some of the horrific abuses that many people have chronicled. And still, the tethers around you were tight enough that it took you 3 years to pull yourself out.
Yes. And that is partly the community. And I'm aware that community is a incredibly precious commodity. It's just unbelievably important. And partly it was when I left Scientology, I also dropped a community. So that would often pull me back in a really major way. Absolutely.
People that you cared about.
Mm-hmm. Deeply cared about. So that would often pull me back in. Yeah.
So when you look back, I detect from this story that there was a time when you were sort of looking back and really finger wagging yourself. How could I be so foolish? How could I have been seduced in this way? How could I have given up so much? How could I have lost that time? How did you get past that shameful feeling to looking at it more holistically? What decisions did you make, or practices did you use to get over that bump or through that dark forest, if you will?
Yes, indeed. Well, a lot of it, frankly, as a writer to a writer, was writing. Beginning, I'd always been journaling during all those years. I was journaling, but it was, when I look back on it, it's very much mostly a pumping up of myself, of it's all good, it's all great, look what you're getting, look what you're solving. I think what really helped in my case was distance, was applying to the Iowa Writers Workshop and getting accepted. And then that 2,000 miles away from Los Angeles helped a great deal. I could not even understand just how much until later. And then also just, I would say, sweating it. I could not sleep for I would say it felt like a year or two. I was I'd been so convinced of the idea of my immortal soul and that I might be jeopardizing its immortality. Believe it or not, I felt I was familiar. I became very sympathetic to Catholics who, that deathbed conversion thing where, you get the priest there just in case. And I wondered about that, and I just would steep. I remember, because both Scientological perspective as well as parental ones growing up, you never took a sleeping pill, would never occur to me. I would steep like 3 sleepy time tea bags in a cup of water and just drink that bitter brew. And then that would help me crash into sleep. But then I'd wake up and then all the horrible things that would become of my life. I mean, it was a terrible, and there was no internet at the time. There was no way to know other people were going through this, which they were. And now, I mean, there's so much wonderful stuff out there. The Aftermath Foundation, which helps get people places to stay should they manage to leave, and get them jobs, because of course often they've got no resume, no experience, because they've spent all their time inside the church doing not much it's hard to put on a CV or a resume. They're wonderful things, but for me it was just bully on through, and I confided in very few people at the time. I was, as I say in the book, as if I was a murderer rather than a pilgrim. I just felt that I was again mortified. And then eventually it was moving to this wonderful town, Nevada City, which was a complete, beautiful fluke, accident, piece of serendipity, finding my way to an African dance class, finding my way to a Vipassana meditation class, finding my way to a fantastic theater company, getting involved in theater, doing tons of theater, writing my first novel and getting it published. All of that began to assuage that horrible stuff. And just, it would be a little bit like my fingers were in my ears and I was going, no, 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 to keep all ideas and thoughts of that previous decade away. So a lot of it was bullying it through.
Well, and so at first it required you to kind of pretend it hadn't happened.
Yes.
To do what you needed to do next. And then what was it like for you to then reconnect it? To say, well, now wait a minute, that was 10 years. I want to now look at that closely and write about it and really do this. What switched you?
Well, it was this. I was teaching a myth and fairy tale class at Franklin and Marshall College. It was a course I'd proposed to the English department, and I was just delighted when they said, go ahead. And there's this word autodidact, which means you teach yourself. And that's what I did. I'd never taken a course in fairy tale. I'd read some books about mythology, but never studied a course. So I just did a crash course. And of course, who shows up, of course, is Joseph Campbell. And of course, we'd all heard of his Hero with 1,000 Faces. And I even lugged that book around with me for a while. It's heavy and big, and eventually abandoned it. But that idea that there's many steps to the hero's journey, but the three big ones are: you leave the known world, you descend into an underworld where ideally you face a bunch of demons and figure something important out, and then you return to the known world with that lesson. Those are the three major steps of the hero's journey. And I had my students write up what might be their own hero's journey, or what might be the hero's journey of a public figure that they might be associated with or like. What kind of things had people overcome, historical figures, etc. And periodically it would occur to me, Sands, you could look at this as a hero's journey, your trip into Scientology. And I would say, no, that was just a big, big mistake. But it kept coming up for me. And of course, studying it and presenting it in class and reading all of these essays by my wonderful students and teaching it in class, I finally went, maybe you should just take a look at the hero's journey in terms of your own life. What was that decade for you? Is there a way that there is a boon down there in what you think of as huge darkness that you've actually returned to? It's a rather new known world. Whoever thought I'd be a professor at a liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, but it's my known world. And that is what started.
That's a really huge takeaway, because I don't know anybody that doesn't have some period of their life that they say, "Ooh, if I was going to go back, I wouldn't do that." Whether it was a relationship that was either just not so healthy or abusive or awful, or just a regrettable one, or a job or a career path or a place that one lived. It's often true for folks to look back, and it's that transition between looking at it shamefully with regret and viewing it as lost, or viewing yourself rather instead of as a shameful person, as a hero going through that dark time and coming out of it. That's a really big shift.
Huge shift. And you have just described exactly what I began to realize once I could dare to whisper, to say above a whisper, when people would ask me what my memoir was about. Well, it's about these years I spent in Scientology. I just couldn't even say the word. And once I was able to say, well, I'm trying to write about what I have thought of for ages as lost years, the number of people who would say, oh, before I even finished that sentence, oh, I know what you mean.
Lost years.
The 4 years when I was in Cleveland, or the 8 years with that terrible husband, or gosh, I had this horrible bout with OxyContin and I thank my lucky stars I got out of that. So many people, and even it's sometimes minor, in terms of what we might think, but for that person, huge.
Right.
A sense of having wasted a part of their lives.
Mm.
And it was amazing to realize and wonderful to realize I was not unique in this regard. It was great.
Which means you're not uniquely awful, right?
I'm not uniquely awful. And I didn't spend, sometimes the stories would be hair raising, I didn't spend, years in a cult helping to abuse children. I have a friend who did that, and unbelievable that they've managed to make their way back from those horrors and do whatever redemptive stuff. They're still trying to do redemptive stuff, but so then all of a sudden things got put into perspective, oh, well, you spent a lot of time studying quote unquote applied religious philosophy as written out by L. Ron Hubbard, and being kind of separated from real life. But it's not as awful. You didn't do icky things to people, So it was good. It was a great relief.
So I understand you've got a short passage that you wanted to read for us as a last bit here.
Yes, I do. It mentions that idea of the myth and fairy tale course that I was teaching. And basically, this is the short passage. For years, I thought of my time in Scientology, the shame attached to the woods underworld where I'd spent so much time, as unique. I was not able to see it as simply a version of a journey taken by most of us at some point in this life. But as I began to write and finally to speak openly about that squandered decade, I heard from many who'd taken or been led into detours from their own expected lives. Often these were shy, whispered conversations as they confided their own shame, what they perceived as their own failures, the decade in the terrible marriage, the years lost to OxyContin, the time in an ashram agreeing to and participating in sexual coercion, the transgender child whose transition tore apart not only the family but a cherished religious community. We've all had to take careful, sometimes very difficult inventory to determine how those years and those experiences led to where we are now. And that, for better or worse, and it takes time and tinkering and perspective to find that better, we wouldn't be who we are without having had those years and learned those lessons in our particular underworlds. That is, after darkness, because of darkness, we determine how to start again.
Wonderful. Sands, I could talk to you for hours and hours about this. And fortunately, you've given us a couple of 100 pages to understand it more in your beautiful book, Reclaiming My Decade Lost in Scientology. I recommend it with whole heart to anyone listening, particularly anybody who's looking back at a time of their life with regret. It's a merciful book in that way. And I thank you so much for sharing it. And thank you for being part of the Morning Glory Project.
Betsy, thank you with all my heart. Such wonderful questions. You're such a guiding spirit on this earth, and I'm grateful for you. Thank you.
Thinking about my conversation with Sands Hall today, I'm mindful of the idea of regret. And I started calculating really how much time I have wasted looking back with regret, wondering if I'd have taken the left fork in the road instead of the right, doing what I call mental autopsies on conversations that could have gone differently. And I wonder how much that keeps me from living in the present. I really love Sand's idea of looking back and reclaiming lost time, reclaiming time that we thought was wasted, and having a new word for that. I really like that idea, and I know that everybody has some choice in their past that they wish they'd have made differently. But we rob ourselves of the present when we don't live in it. That's a good extra bloom to hold on to today. Thank you so much for listening to the Morning Glory Project. I know there's lots of competition for your time, and that you'd spend any of it with me is truly an honor. If you've enjoyed this episode or any episode of the Morning Glory Project, we'd sure appreciate a 5-star review where you get your podcast. That helps us get seen. And gosh, if you're so inclined, share us out on social media. You may have friends and loved ones that could benefit from the guests on this show. Thanks so much for listening. Go out and bloom.